Welcome to this edition of In Our Community. I'm your host, Tasha Lane, and today in our studio, I'd like to welcome the producer of this show, Marc Potter, who's here to share his love for poetry. Thank you, Marc, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you like to do poetry, I hear.
Yes, 45 years or so.
So you've been writing a long time?
Yeah.
Okay, so what inspired you to write poetry? How did you get on that pathway?
I think for me it was a kind of freedom. My childhood was pretty hard, so it was a way for me to go off by myself and have some form of freedom.
Did you read poetry a lot when you were younger, or?
I didn't read a lot at home because I didn't bring books home from a library or anything. We were kind of restricted on our travel as kids, but some of my teachers at school would teach us various poems, and I tried to sit in one of the first rows and really liked poetry and literature and soaked it up pretty well. And of course, if we had an assignment in a book, then I could study those pieces.
Okay. Do you have a favorite poet?
I do have a favorite poet. Adrienne Rich. She wrote a lot of books. She passed a few years back, but one of her most famous poems is called Diving into the Wreck. And it's a really quite remarkable poem. And she put out a lot of books, but that's my favorite poem.
That's your favorite one. So, and with poetry, I noticed that oftentimes there's different writing styles.
Yes.
Some are, abstract, and some are rhythmic and rhymey.
Yes.
So how would you describe your writing style?
My writing style is different in each manuscript. This manuscript is, I would say, sort of normal. It's normal poetry. Now, in today's society, a lot of poets are starting to write poems that look like prose. So some of these are like that. But another style that I love that's not in this book is absurdism.
What is that?
Well, Americans haven't really heard of it. It's a style used in Scandinavia and Europe a lot. It's, in American terms, I guess I would say, it's a way of having things, turning things on their head, having things seem ridiculous. And I like that style because I want people to not be in these cliche ditches where we say the same thing to each other every day, over and over. So in these types of poems, extremely unexpected things are said.
Okay, and I think you have some of that in your poetry tonight.
Well, I don't. There's not well, a little bit, but it's not nearly what.
How extreme it can get.
Yes.
Huh? Okay.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
All right.
That's
so
true, yeah.
We're going to read. I've read a couple of your poems, and one of them is called Bananas, and I think you are going to speak to that in just a moment.
Yes.
So what is the story behind Bananas?
This young lady she's on the beach, and she's like maybe early 20s or late teens. She and her boyfriend were going to meet on the beach. And you know how men are. They're always late, always disrespectful, almost always. And so she's here on the beach, and he's late, and this is what happens while she's waiting.
Okay.
What she thinks and such.
Well, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Bananas. A young girl walks slowly across the dirty red sand of this forgotten beach. She is supposed to meet a boy here, a boy for whom she has feelings, a boy who professes to have feelings for her as well. Minutes pass. Then more minutes pass. Cockatoos chatter in their tropically odd way. There is no telling what they have to say. A breeze rises across the water, coming onto the beach to lift a few of the lighter pieces of garbage from the sand. For example, tissues, a man's stylish handkerchief, such as you would see in the breast pocket of an evening jacket. This makes her think of prom night. Will he also stand me up on prom night, she thinks? Having watched her father, as many times as eternity, look lovingly in her mother's eyes and say, "I'm sorry, dearest, it will never happen again." The girl glances at the bananas on the trees. Some are green, some are greenish yellow, some are yellow ripe.
Okay, so you know what stood out when you were reading and when I read this earlier is your attention to the colors of the bananas. And I know that sometimes with poetry, you know, there's a hidden meaning or there's some symbolism. Is there a message that you're trying to communicate by describing the colors of these bananas?
I like to think of it as the path of maturity. This young lady's going through things that most young ladies go through. They get a boyfriend who's, not every man is disrespectful, but certainly this gentleman is being disrespectful. And so she may be, perhaps at this part of her life, maybe she's a little bit green about relationship. Hopefully she grows to the point where she can, you know, over time she's greenish yellow, and then later she knows not to take this kind of thing from a gentleman, you know. So.
Right. I've been this girl. Yeah.
I believe it.
And when I read it, I'm like, did he ever show up? Where's the other piece to this? Did he ever?
No, it's like waiting for Godot. He never showed up.
Okay. So what was your motivation for writing this?
I tell you, some pieces, most pieces don't have a motivation. It's just, I feel like it just comes to me. It just comes through. I either capture it or I don't. Some nights I'm falling asleep and a poem idea comes up and I have to decide, you're going to drag yourself out of bed and get some of this, or you're going to just fall asleep. And it's 50-50. So I don't know where it came from. I don't like beaches. I don't like water.
Do you like bananas?
I like ladies. I love bananas.
Okay.
But I sure don't like beaches. You can't get me on a beach.
Okay.
But it just came by and I captured it. So, yeah.
So do you ever write about your life experiences, or are you writing about what you're observing in life as opposed to it being a personal thing?
It's more me observing. I don't usually put my own life in poems. Sometimes in my short prose I will. In the poems, not as often. Not as often.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know where they come from. And there was a famous writer once said, when I wrote this poem, God and I both knew what it meant. Now only God knows.
Do you know what it means now?
Well, as much as I interpreted to you today. I mean, yeah.
All right. So you have another poem that you're going to share with us called Centipede.
Yes, and this is one of the few humorous pieces. I don't write humorous pieces very often. I don't. Anyway, so this is a interesting story about a centipede. A centipede is arguing furiously about his speeding ticket, having carefully forgotten about the rolling stop he committed 2 stops back. But no one is fooled. Neither the officer, a tall blonde woman with a withered face, nor her young trainee, a kid so green he remembers what they had for lunch at the academy on Thursdays. Sometimes there is room for expansive compassion, and thus, sometimes there, excuse me, I read it wrong. Sometimes there is very little room for expansive compassion, and thus, in an act of tough love, she throws the book at him. Unfortunately, this book, the California Vehicle Code, being inordinately heavy, slips, squashing the centipede into a paper-thin paste, a paste for which no one has yet to find a resourceful use.
Okay, so much for the centipede. He's gone.
Yeah, he's pretty much,
he's gone.
He could be on toast at this point.
So what was your thought process when you were putting this piece together?
Well, I like birds and bugs and animals and nature. I don't like going out in it. I like being an armchair adventurer. And I just got this thought about a centipede. You know, centipedes are called that because they have 100 legs. And so wouldn't it be interesting if because they had so many legs, they could go fast? Right. They probably can't, but it would be interesting if they could. And so it kind of started out there. And then I saw something on TV, a movie or a television show where someone got stopped by the police, and it was a woman, and she was trying to be risque with the officer, was a motorcycle cop, thinking she would get the ticket, you know, reduced. Turned out the officer was a woman who got even more furious with her for pulling that stunt. So this is why in this piece the officer throws the book at him. It's from something I saw on TV.
Is there a hidden message in there, or?
Probably not. It's probably just a poem. And this thing, I watch a lot of cop shows.
Okay.
This thing about the kid being so green, I saw that on TV too, where I didn't see it exactly like this, but when the new recruits graduate, they get a little bit of teasing from the veteran officers about, you know, the academy.
Being the newbie.
Being the newbies.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
How long did it take you to write it?
It's kind of surprising. I can usually get a first draft, and then I have to let it sit for like a month or a month and a half. If I'm willing to do that, when I come back, I can see things that need to be changed, and I'm just listening to an inner voice, and things say, oh, this could be changed and that could be changed. Like her weathered face, that I felt helped a lot, make it more real or have a little more depth.
And you have a lot of poems in here. How many make it to the manuscript versus you just say forget?
Probably. This manuscript started out with about 150 pages.
Oh, wow.
And it's 30 pages now, so not too many make it, but I want to do the best I can. You know, I want to put out the very best poems I can.
Yeah, and what steps do you go through when you're writing poetry? Do you think, is there a process that you go through? Do you think about, you know, what's going on in the world or what you experienced that day?
I do a lot of meditation. I'm a student of Zen. So I feel like I meditate, and then later in the day, that meditation has kind of opened me up to both my own consciousness and my own unconsciousness. And so if something's happening in the world, I usually sort of morph that so it's unrecognizable and write it in a way that you wouldn't know that it was about, you know, something that happened in Berlin or something that happened in Tokyo that day or anything. It's just, I take it a few steps away. There was a thing I learned in math. You know, math and music and poetry are actually closer than they look. And one of our teachers taught us about extrapolation. So you take something and you kind of take it a few steps away. And also it helps me feel like I'm not just griping about the world or... Topical poems don't last very long. They get old quicker than timeless poems, so I try to make them a little bit more timeless.
Okay, all right.
So
you have another one that you're going to share with us called Train Wreck. And
I'm not a fan of the happy ending. So this one, I have a blog, and I send out the blog. I've done over 1,000 blogs since 2012. And one of the people who's one of the best poets in the group said that he thought this was one of my better poems. So this is a piece I like. Train wreck. Regarding the train, the flowers along the side of the track were particularly beautiful and unusually abundant. The stem of the flowers seemed more like a support mechanism on which the tiny flowers sat. The tiny flowers were an interesting multicolored yellow, 5 petals each flower, a rather bright yellow out near the top of each petal, not fading but simply lessening as the petal made its way back to the stem. As the center of the flower, half of a sphere of the most tiny white balls rather than having a little concave spot that a golf ball might have, these tiny flowers had convex spots, which made the blossoming pop even more. The physical plant was a very homogeneous green, as though all the plants were in some sort of agreement. And the plants, though rather tall and ever so thick, so very thick that one could not make their way through them without quite a great effort indeed, these plants were actually very soft and pliable and thin. That is to say, the leaves, while large, were thin, and the stems of the plants, while tall, were extraordinarily thin. Mm-hmm. And the plants in no way looked odd, even though anatomically, of course, they indeed were odd. No, they looked both interesting, as I have described, but also interested. They sat at a bevel to the railroad tracks as though they were the perfect stadium audience, the green being like bleachers, of course, slanting constantly upward away from the playing field, if you will, of the railroad tracks, and the little yellow flowers being like people looking upon the wreckage of the train down on the tracks with its odd blossoming of its own.
Very surprising ending there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was very tempted not to give it the title Trainwreck, so it was even more surprising, but one has to give the audience some hope. So
what was your inspiration for writing this?
I think this one really was news articles. There was a movie. It was not just the movie, the art. You know, there's been some train wrecks lately where trains, go out of control. But there was a movie a while back, I think it was called Super 8 or something, where this child captured a train wreck of some kind. I've yet to watch the movie all the way through, and so there was a big to-do about what was on the train, et cetera, et cetera. So it's an interesting thing because I'm from the Midwest. A train wreck is somehow more touching to me than some spectacular, esoteric thing that goes on in the world. I can't relate to it as well. But a train wreck, I've been on train tracks when you like one place in our town, there were 2 tracks. And my brother and I were coming back from work, and train went by, went on the tracks, here comes another train. We almost got smashed up in real life, so there's a lot there for me about trains.
Yeah, it was just, as I was following along with you, you went into detail about the flowers, and they had the life of its own. And then at the end, the flowers almost become a character, a person.
Yes, anthropomorphism, we call it, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So you spoke earlier about your time in school and teachers giving you projects and things like that with poetry. So do you feel like, because you're self-taught, I've been told you're self-taught.
Yes.
What role does education and training do you think would play in forming a good poet or writer?
Well, part of the reason I'm self-taught is by choice. I have, like with everything in society, I seem to be the rebel or the one who's irritated about the way things are done. Writers who are famous sometimes, and I really want to say oftentimes, but I'll try to be gracious and say sometimes, the way they get there is they pay a lot of money to go to writers' conferences. They get to know the person who runs the writers' conference, and then they get their poem published. You buy your way in, the way you buy your way in almost every part of society. And while, yes, I wouldn't mind being a little more well-known, although I am reclusive, I don't want to be part of that system. I didn't want to be a professor who sucked up to somebody higher up on the chain, or maybe it's a mistake on my part, but it's just something I still feel strongly about.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you think that poetry does for the world? Do you think that it contributes to the world in some way?
I think it contributes. In the United States, as you may already realize, we don't pay a lot of attention to poetry. There was a time maybe 50, 60 years ago in other countries, for example, Russia, which is not very popular right now, but it used to be back in the middle of the last century, people in Russia would spend an evening, they'd go out and have dinner, and then they'd go to a poetry reading. And that would be a very lovely evening for a middle-class couple. And we rarely do that in this country. Dylan Thomas, who was a poet in the last century, could garner a very large crowd. We have a few people like that now, like Billy Collins, who is a very funny poet who used to be Poet Laureate of the United States. By the way, Tracy K. Smith just became Poet Laureate, I think she's our first African-American Poet Laureate. So she just, last week.
Tracy K. Smith.
Tracy K. Smith.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, she's Obama appointed a woman to be the Librarian of Congress who is African-American. I think you should check this out with somebody who knows what they're talking about, but she, I think, has the power to appoint the Poet Laureate, and so she appointed Tracy. And very cool poet, really, very sharp. So, yeah. So
when you're writing poetry, just like any other writer, I would imagine you have some writer's block from time to time.
Oh, God. Sometimes it lasts for months and months and months.
Where you can't write anything? You
can't write. You couldn't write a grocery list. And you think you're going to... Sometimes it gets really serious, I think. Now, I've been asked this question in a different way in the past, because oftentimes when I'm interviewed, people ask pretty much the same questions. Someone asked, how do you advise someone else to break their writer's block?
Right.
What I would say to that is you take a notebook or a stack of paper, you put it on the table in front of you. This will make no sense to the conscious mind, but it will sometimes work. Take some paper. I realize you're probably writing on a computer. Go out and buy some paper. Put it on a table. Take a pen. Sit it on the paper at an angle.
And what does that do?
And walk away.
Walk away.
Yep. I didn't say it was going to make sense, did I?
No, it does. Well, it doesn't make sense, but there's a method.
There's something about the unconscious mind that it helps. And it's helped me a couple times. There's a lot, we use, 3% of our brains? I mean, there's a lot going on there that we don't use. So I don't know if we have time for this next piece. I didn't think we would, but we might. I like this piece, this piece here. It's called Eyes. I'll try to read it somewhat quickly. I don't know how much time we have left, but this one is close to my heart. It's kind of like something that almost happened in real life. So it's close to my heart.
Okay. I'm going to listen.
All right.
I can't find it in my stack. But
oh, really? Okay, page 5. Page 5 and 6. 5, 6, and 7.
All righty. Go ahead. I'm with you.
It was not a metaphor. I really did open my eyes. By sliding my eyelids back into my head. The eyelids, coated in nondescript pale skin and nearly invisible eyelashes. There was no applause from an adoring crowd. Just me, myself, sitting on a somewhat uncomfortable wooden chair, not a chair that barked asceticism. And neither was what I saw then important, such that anyone else would raise their eyebrows in surprise. I saw a hopelessly small closet, its makeshift door begging the clothes that lay in a heap on the floor for some kind of mercy or understanding. I saw black pants hanging upside down from a bookshelf above, all the books having been sold for food or writing materials. The bookshelf now acting as a handler of clothes, especially to dry the clothing, now soaking in the sink. These conditions and practices were to never be revealed until after his death. The smell was atrocious, of course. A forgotten saucepan here, an elected item of trash, having been left on the counter as some sort of companion. If you want a metaphor, then I was he, and he, of course, was gone, having inexplicably left me in his apartment alone. I had told him I would clean up a bit, you see, and that is an explanation for you if you need or desire one. He could not bear to watch his things being cleaned, nor his things being put in any order whatsoever, neither my eyelids opening. He did not like particularly watching his favorite black pants, the ones threadbare at the bottom from having been black pants for so long. And so my eyes did open. There is nothing else to report. A stray termite here or there, looking for a community. An old 78 LP record leaning up against a 1970s boombox player, or a Walkman, or some other hopelessly mismatched couple from a strangled past. Some alleyways that I have taken for a home looked more organized than this. He asked me to make sure not to clean too much, just enough to obey the recent edict of the landlord. See, there is an explanation for everything. So I pretended that all the items were snowflakes, and I picked them up in hazardous groups, threw them to the ceiling, the highest of the cathedral ceilings, and I watched them fall again. Then I went downstairs to his landlord, gave him $352. Leave him alone, I said.
Mm-hmm. It's emotional.
He's an old man. He's an old man and has very little time to live. Then I reached in my pocket again, enough for the landlord to see the shiny butt of my Glock. The carrot and the stick, I said. The carrot and the stick.
That's a very powerful piece and a really nice finish to the show. I'm glad you were able to get through it. Very well done. Very well done. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your poetry with us.
Thank you.
I'm Tasha Lane. I'm your host tonight for In Our Community. Thank you to the audience, and thank you for all of you that are here as part of the crew. Thank you again. Good night.
Thank you, honey.
You did a great job.